Hey everyone, hopefully this is a short video. I mean, in my mind it's supposed to be a shorter video, but we'll see. Today I wanted to talk about John chapter 3 and John chapter 3 specifically. As you all know, hopefully anyways, the Gospels were written not in Hebrew, Latin, Aramaic, or even English, but in Greek. Jesus, as we all know, hopefully, is an Aramaic speaking Jew, and so the Bible that we read today in English is a translation of a translation. This also means that when Jesus speaks in the Gospels, he's not speaking his own language. If some of the sayings from the Gospels can somehow be traced back to a certain historical Jesus, there is no doubt there can be things lost in translation. Combine this with the fact that the first Gospel we have wasn't written until a generation after the death of Jesus, we can assume that perhaps people shared the traditions and stories about Jesus orally. Now there's plenty of problems with oral tradition, but to make it short, imagine you're in a classroom. I'll maybe have a drawing for this, and there's a row of 6 students, and there's 6 people on that row. That guy from the very back reads a message and has to pass the message to the guy in front of them. The guy at the very back only has, let's say, 10 seconds to read and memorize the message, which let's say is 2 sentences long. The game starts and the guy at the back whispers to the front, and then the guy whispers to the guy in front of them, and so on until the guy at the very front row has to write the message down on the chalkboard. Now, do you think the guy at the front will be able to accurately write the original message? Well, if you think yes, you might be wrong, as this very game was played in our classroom by our teacher and most of us got it wrong. Now, of course, this game isn't a good tool for explaining the problems for oral tradition. I mean, there were many factors in the game, like, the guy at the back being pressured, or the limited time kind of pressuring everyone else to get it to get the message as quickly as, to get the message across as quickly as possible. Or maybe the students were just terrible. That could also be a possibility. But it does show just how easily the message can get lost through word of mouth. One can easily misunderstand what the other person says, or suddenly someone no longer has access to the original message. In the case of oral tradition and religion, one's biases can easily affect what message they'll transmit. If something sounds subjectively off for someone, or if someone misunderstands something, then the whole accuracy falls apart. This is all happening, mind you, while the people communicating the message are speaking the same language. Then you add in the translation, and it can easily become a mess. Go back 2,000 years ago when it wasn't common to keep accurate records, and now you have a truckload of problems. Now, what does this have anything to do with John chapter 3? Well, John chapter 3 is very interesting. If you look up the Greek to English of John chapter 3, or just read the story, there's a few things I want to point out. Now, in the story, Jesus is visited by a wise Pharisee named Nicodemus, who is amazed at Jesus' power and wit. Jesus suddenly changes topic by telling him that unless one is born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. Nicodemus rightfully gets confused by this, asking Jesus how this can be that a grown man like him can return to his mother's womb and be born a second time. Jesus clarifies this confusion by saying, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless one is born of water and the Spirit, he cannot enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus does repeat the born again phrase in verse 7. "Do not marvel that I said to you, you must be born again." Now, the version of the Bible I use here is the New King James Version. Let's switch over to the New Revised Standard Version, which is the more accurate version translated by scholars. "Very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born from above." Nicodemus said to him, "How can anyone be born after having grown old? Can he enter a second time into the mother's womb and be born?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God without being born of water and spirit." Yeah, a bit of a difference. Jesus says born from above, yet Nicodemus still confuses it to mean be born a second time. In verse 7, Jesus also says born of above. Now, what's the deal here? Well, I teased it in the beginning. It's about the language the gospel is written in, Greek. Look at chapter 3, verse 3. I'll highlight it for you guys and highlight the Greek to English on the left as I speak each word. Jesus answered and said unto him, "Verily, verily, I say unto thee, except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." The words born again are translated from the Greek word anoten, which has a few interesting meanings. It usually means from above, usually pertaining to a sort of divine or heavenly realm. But it could also mean from the first or from the beginning, and it could also mean anew, which could mean again. Hence, we get the famous born again phrase. In fact, many Christian denominations call themselves born again Christians because of this. Now granted, there are other verses that speak of being born again in relation to being a Christian, like 2 Corinthians 5:17 or 1 Peter 1:23, but I haven't looked into the Greek to English of those verses, so for now we'll stick with John chapter 3. Now I didn't bring this up to trash on Christians calling themselves born again. To be born again in the Christian context is metaphorical anyways for starting a new life, which is kind of what being converted to Christianity means. The reason why I bring this up is because of what I'll say next. So in John chapter 3, Jesus likely meant at first in verse 3 to say be born of above, but since anoten could mean born again or anew, Nicodemus mistakes this to be what Jesus originally meant, which explains why Jesus corrects him in verse 5, saying that you need to be born of water and spirit, clarifying that what is born of flesh is flesh and of spirit, spirit. Well, that's pretty interesting. Nicodemus mistakes Jesus, and because he used a word that conveniently means be born again and born of above. But I'm not done. I realized that this misunderstanding that happens between Jesus and Nicodemus cannot be replicated in any other languages, at least I don't think so. That the misunderstanding can't be replicated in English, that's for sure, since we use different words to mean from above and anew or again. We don't really have a word that's like the Greek word anoten. Jesus was an Aramaic speaking peasant in the Roman Empire. Sure, Greek was the most common spoken language, but it was the elite and higher class people who learned and spoke Greek. Now, it has been suggested by some that Jesus was trilingual in the sense that he can speak Aramaic, which was his main language. He can speak a little Greek when he needs to, say he's in the city of Tiberias, or he visits Sepphoris, which isn't too far from Nazareth. And it's also been suggested that he can read Hebrew. But there's literally no evidence that Jesus himself can speak Greek. Well, okay, we'll get into... I know you're thinking of Pontius Pilate, but we'll get into that later. For the sake of the argument, let's assume Jesus can speak a little bit of Greek. Later on in his life, he does get to stand in front of Roman Governor Pontius Pilate anyways. Now, while I don't believe the conversations in the Gospel of John between Pilate and Jesus happened, for the sake of the argument, let's assume Jesus knew enough Greek that he could have a word with Pilate or two. Let's also assume that Jesus has the God powers to speak in Greek, because of course he does. The conversation is still not plausible to be historical, since both participants of the conversation, Jesus and Nicodemus, were Jews. This isn't a conversation between a Greek philosopher and Jesus. This is a conversation between two Aramaic-speaking Jews. Now sure, a high-ruling Pharisee like Nicodemus may have been able to speak Greek, but it makes no sense for Nicodemus to speak to Jesus, whom he knows is a Galilean peasant, in Greek. Sure, you could say they were speaking in Aramaic, but Jesus switched languages to Greek, kind of like that scene in The Passion of the Christ where Pilate speaks to Jesus in Aramaic, but Jesus catches him off guard by speaking in Latin, which for the film is the language of the Romans, which is incorrect, by the way. The Romans spoke Greek in those times. Even if that were the case, the Gospel makes no indication of this. Nicodemus is confused by Jesus' usage of anoten, not the fact that he switched languages. So it means that it's kind of unlikely this conversation ever even happened. Which sounds kind of heartbreaking, you might say, because it also means that Jesus never said John 3:16, the most well-known Bible verse that even non-Christians know about, since they hear it all the time. Also notice how it said perish and not burn in hell forever? Anyways, just because this conversation may have not happened, it doesn't mean it's all of a sudden theologically insignificant. Sure, it may not be something historical, but I ask you Christians, is John 3:16 wrong? Well, no, not for you anyways. The spiritual contents of John 3 are still true for a lot of people. The reason why I say this is because there are many things in the Bible which are not historical, and many of us think that it's some sort of deal breaker for staying in the faith, since we're used to being given only two choices. You're either an atheist or a conservative fundamentalist. But we are not strictly limited to those two choices. The Bible may or may not contain different truths that are not limited by science or history. I say this because many of the biblical authors could be considered liars in a sense, such as the writers of the forged letters of Paul or the writer of the book of Peter who claims to be Peter but isn't. One might call these pseudonymous authors liars, but let me ask you something. Do you think it's justified to lie sometimes? Well, when is it justified to lie? For some, it could be if you have an important message to tell. If, for example, the author of Peter wrote their text without claiming to be from authority, would anyone read it? Well, what if the author thinks what they're saying is important? How do you convey that message if you're nobody? Well, you claim it by saying it's from someone of authority, from a figure of authority. Likewise, if you have an important line of dialogue which you think conveys some sort of truth, you put it in Jesus or God's mouth. Jesus, and God for that matter, are as inconsistent as they are in the Bible because they are literary characters whom the author uses as their spokesperson, of course while believing that what they say is true and is from God. But those are just my thoughts. This was supposed to just be a video about John chapter 3, but it's transitioned to being now about forgery. Anyways, that is all.
Oh, we're going to the pasture to meet Adelaide and ask her if she has a way to send us back where we came from. I don't know who she is or how she is or when or why she is, but as for where she is where we will go to Adelaide.